The morning light spilled through the tall windows of Seoul National University's music department as Min Jae Park organized sheet music into neat piles. The 23-year-old administrative assistant worked with quiet efficiency, her movements careful and precise. Students and professors rushed past her desk, many not bothering to look up from their phones or sheet music as they hurried to morning classes. Min Jae preferred it this way, the comfortable invisibility of being part of the background. "Min Jae, could you bring these practice schedules to Professor Lee's office?" asked Mrs. Kang, the department secretary, dropping a folder on her desk. Min Jae nodded with a small smile. "Of course." As she walked down the hallway lined with practice rooms, the sound of music, some beautiful, some painfully amateur, leaked through the doors. Her steps unconsciously fell into rhythm with a student practicing a Chopin nocturne, her fingers twitching slightly at her side. She quickly shoved her hand into her pocket. Professor Lee's door stood open. Inside, he was engaged in a heated discussion with Professor Kim, the department's most demanding piano instructor. Min Jae hesitated, not wanting to interrupt. "We need another teaching assistant for the beginner classes," Professor Kim said, running his hand through his salt and pepper hair. "These first-year students can barely read sheet music, let alone play anything worth listening to." "The budget won't allow for another assistant until next semester," Professor Lee sighed. "We'll have to make do." Min Jae cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, Professor Lee, the practice schedules you requested." Both men turned and Professor Lee smiled warmly. "Ah, Min Jae, thank you." As she placed the folder on his desk, his eyes lit up with a sudden idea. "Actually, wait a moment." Min Jae froze, hand still outstretched. "You've been with us for almost a year now. You must have picked up something about piano working in a music department all day," Professor Lee said. Min Jae's throat tightened. Just basic knowledge, sir." Professor Kim studied her with sudden interest. "Do you play at all?" "I took lessons as a child," she answered, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. "Nothing serious. Perfect." Professor Lee clapped his hands together. "You can help demonstrate the basics for our beginner classes. Just simple scales and elementary pieces. It would be a tremendous help until we can hire another teaching assistant." Min Jae felt her heart begin to race, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. 8 years. It had been 8 years since she'd touched a piano key. 8 years of deliberately walking the long way around music stores, of changing radio stations when certain composers came on, of making excuses to avoid friends' recitals. "I'm not sure I'd be much help," she said quietly. "It's been a very long time." Professor Kim waved his hand dismissively. "The pieces are elementary. Even someone with childhood lessons could manage them. Just some simple Mozart and Bach exercises." Min Jae looked between the two professors, searching for a way out. But Professor Lee was already nodding enthusiastically, and Professor Kim looked relieved to have found a solution to his problem. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her shoulders. I'll try my best," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wonderful." Professor Lee beamed. "You'll start tomorrow with Professor Kim's 9 o'clock class." Min Jae nodded mechanically and excused herself. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her as she made her way back to her desk. The sounds from the practice rooms now felt like they were closing in around her, a suffocating wall of music she had spent years trying to escape. That night, in her small apartment, Min Jae sat on the edge of her bed staring at her hands. Long, slender fingers with short, practical nails. Pianist's hands. Her mother had always said so. From the moment 3-year-old Min Jae had first reached for their old upright piano. "Such beautiful hands," her mother would say. "Made for greatness." Min Jae clenched her fists, then slowly relaxed them. Against her will, her right hand began to move, fingers pressing invisible keys in a pattern she could still feel, still hear in her mind. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, the piece that had been her favorite once, before everything fell apart. She stood abruptly and walked to her small kitchen, putting on the kettle for tea. As the water heated, she pulled out her phone and opened a browser. Her fingers hesitated, then typed, "Basic piano finger exercises." The results loaded, and Min Jae forced herself to look at the diagrams, the simple C major scale fingerings. Surely she could manage this much. Just basics, just enough to help the beginners without revealing herself. The kettle whistled, startling her so badly she nearly dropped her phone. Get it together. She muttered to herself as she prepared her tea. It's just a piano. Just a job. But as she sipped her tea, memories flooded back. The massive concert hall in Warsaw, the spotlight hot on her face, the weight of expectations from her teachers, her parents, her country. She had been 15, the youngest finalist in her division at the International Chopin competition. The prodigy from South Korea, the next great hope, and then, the moment her fingers first touched the keys of the Steinway on stage, something had broken inside her. A sudden, overwhelming certainty that she would fail, that she wasn't good enough, that everyone would finally see she was a fraud. Her hands had begun to shake uncontrollably. Notes she had played perfectly thousands of times became jumbled, dissonant. The sympathetic murmurs from the audience only made it worse. She had managed to finish the piece barely. But as she walked off stage, she knew her career was over. She never played in public again. The next morning, Min-jae arrived at the university 30 minutes early, her eyes shadowed from a restless night. She made her way to the practice room Professor Kim had assigned for the beginner class. It was empty, the morning light casting long rectangles across the floor. In the center sat a baby grand piano, its black surface gleaming. Min-jae approached it slowly as one might approach a sleeping animal. When she reached it, she tentatively lifted the cover over the keys, revealing the familiar pattern of black and white. She pulled out the bench and sat down, her posture automatically adjusting to the perfect form drilled into her since childhood. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. Just scales, she told herself. Just do a few scales to prepare. She placed her right thumb on middle C and pressed down gently. The clear tone rang through the room. Her fingers remembered what to do, moving through a simple C major scale up and down. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath years of avoidance. She tried a G major scale next, then A minor. Each one came more easily than the last, though she kept them slow, deliberate. Nothing that would reveal the years of training, the countless hours of practice. The technique that had once made critics call her the most promising pianist of her generation. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the door opening behind her. Well, that's a relief, said Professor Kim, causing Min-jae to jerk her hands away from the piano as if burned. At least you remember the basics. Min-jae stood quickly, nearly knocking over the bench. I was just warming up, Professor Kim nodded approvingly. Good initiative. The students will be here soon. He placed a folder of sheet music on the piano. These are the pieces they're working on. Nothing complicated. Just demonstrate slowly so they can see proper finger placement. Min-jae glanced at the folder. Simple Czerny exercises, Bach minuets, beginner Clementi sonatinas. Pieces she had mastered before her 8th birthday. Students began filing in, chatting among themselves. They paid little attention to Min-jae, assuming she was just another teaching assistant. Professor Kim introduced her briefly as Ms. Park from the administrative office, who will help demonstrate techniques. The class began with scales. Min-jae demonstrated each one, carefully playing at a beginner's pace, occasionally making small, deliberate mistakes to seem less polished. Professor Kim seemed satisfied, focusing most of his attention on correcting the students' posture and hand positions. Then he opened the folder and assigned each student a piece to work on. Ms. Park will demonstrate the first few measures of each piece so you can hear how they should sound, he announced. One by one, Min-jae played the openings of the simple compositions, fighting to keep her technique constrained, her expression neutral. With each piece, the familiarity of sitting at a piano again both terrified and comforted her. It was like speaking a language she had once been fluent in but had forbidden herself to use. After class, Professor Kim approached her. That was adequate, he said, which Min-jae suspected was high praise coming from him. You play better than I expected for someone with just childhood lessons. Min-jae bowed slightly. Thank you. I hope I was helpful. You'll continue with the Wednesday and Friday morning classes as well, he stated rather than asked. The students respond well to seeing proper technique demonstrated. As she walked back to her desk, Min-jae felt oddly lighter than she had in years, despite the anxiety still fluttering in her chest. For the first time since that disastrous day in Warsaw, she had played piano in front of other people. Granted, it was nothing like the Chopin and Liszt pieces that had once been her specialty, but it was something. She wondered what Professor Kim and the students would think if they knew who she had been once. Min-jae Park, the piano prodigy who had performed with orchestras across Asia and Europe before she was 14. The girl whose recordings of Chopin's ballads had sold thousands of copies. The rising star who had disappeared completely from the classical music world after a single, catastrophic performance. Now she was just Min Jae Park, administrative assistant, playing simple exercises for beginners, and somehow that felt safer than anything had in a very long time. 2 weeks passed and Min Jae settled into a routine. 3 mornings a week she would arrive early to practice the simple pieces before demonstrating them for Professor Kim's beginner classes. The rest of her time was spent at her desk, filing paperwork and answering phones as usual. If her colleagues noticed her slipping away to the practice rooms during lunch breaks, they didn't mention it. It was during one of these lunch sessions that Min Jae allowed herself, for the first time in years, to play something beyond basic exercises. The practice room was tucked away in a rarely used corridor of the music building. She'd checked twice to make sure no one was nearby before closing the door. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. Then, almost of their own accord, they began to move through the opening measures of Mozart's Sonata in C major, K 545. It was a piece often given to intermediate students, nothing too ambitious. But as she played, something inside Min Jae began to unwind. By the time she reached the development section, her hands were steady, her breathing calm. The music flowed naturally, as if it had been waiting inside her all these years. When she finished, she sat in silence, surprised by the absence of panic. Perhaps it was because no one was listening, or perhaps because the piece held no painful memories. Whatever the reason, for a few minutes she had simply been a pianist again. A soft knock on the door shattered her moment of peace. "Min Jae, are you in there?" It was Mrs. Kang. "Professor Kim is looking for you. His advanced class is starting in 5 minutes." Min Jae hastily closed the piano lid. "Coming," she called, gathering her things. Why would Professor Kim want her for his advanced class? She only helped with the beginners. When she arrived at the classroom, Professor Kim was standing before a group of about 15 students, his expression more severe than usual. "Ms. Park, thank you for joining us," he said, gesturing for her to come forward. "Our teaching assistant is out sick today and we have a small problem." Min Jae approached cautiously. "How can I help, Professor?" He pointed to a page of sheet music on the piano stand. Min Jae glanced at it and felt her stomach drop. Chopin's Etude Op. 10 No. 4 in C-sharp minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire, a piece she had once mastered but hadn't touched in 8 years. "These third-year students have been working on this etude for weeks," Professor Kim explained, his voice tinged with frustration. "But they're not grasping the proper technique for the running 16th notes. I demonstrate myself, but my arthritis is particularly bad today." He flexed his fingers as if to prove the point. Min Jae stared at the familiar notes, black marks swimming before her eyes. "Professor, I don't think I can—" "Just the first page," he interrupted. "Play it at half tempo if necessary. They just need to see the proper hand position and weight transfer." The students watched expectantly. One whispered to another, probably wondering why an office worker was being asked to demonstrate such a difficult piece. Min Jae sat down slowly, adjusting the bench automatically. The familiar ritual brought both comfort and dread. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began. The first few measures were hesitant, her fingers searching for their places. But as the music continued, muscle memory took over. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind had tried to forget: the countless hours of practice, the meticulous attention to detail, the way her left hand needed to stay relaxed while her right hand executed the rapid passages. Before she knew it, Min Jae wasn't playing at half-tempo anymore. Her fingers flew across the keys with increasing confidence, drawing out the melodic line hidden within the flurry of notes. The technical challenges that had once required her full concentration now seemed to solve themselves. Something that had been locked away for 8 years was breaking free. She finished the first page and automatically turned to the second, then the third, lost in the music. When the final chord resonated through the room, she sat frozen, hands still on the keys, suddenly aware of what she'd done. The silence that followed was absolute. Min Jae slowly lifted her hands and placed them in her lap, afraid to look up. "Ms. Park." Professor Kim's voice was quiet but intense. Where did you learn to play like that? Min-jae raised her eyes to meet his. The expression on his face and on the faces of the students was one of complete astonishment. I told you I took lessons as a child, she said weakly. One of the students, a young man in the front row, was staring at her with a strange expression. He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Professor Kim approached the piano. No one plays Chopin's Fourth Etude like that with just childhood lessons. That was a professional-level performance. His eyes narrowed. Who are you, really? Before Min-jae could answer, the student with the phone spoke up. Professor, I think I know. He turned his phone screen toward the class. I just searched her name. Min-jae Park, look. Min-jae felt the blood drain from her face as several students gathered around the phone. It says here she was a piano prodigy, one student said, eyes wide. She performed with the Seoul Philharmonic when she was 12. There are YouTube videos of her playing Liszt and Rachmaninoff, another added. Professor Kim looked from the students to Min-jae, his expression changing from suspicion to shock. Min-jae Park, he said slowly, as if remembering something long forgotten. The competition circuit, Warsaw, 8 years ago. Min-jae stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the piano bench. I need to go, she whispered, but her feet wouldn't move. You disappeared, Professor Kim continued, after the Chopin competition. Everyone wondered what happened to you. The room seemed to be closing in around her. The students were all staring now, whispering among themselves. Min-jae could feel the familiar tightness in her chest, the beginning of the panic that had destroyed her career. Please, she managed to say, I can't talk about this. Professor Kim must have seen something in her face because his expression softened. Class dismissed, he announced suddenly. Read chapters 7 and 8 for next time. Practice your assigned pieces. The students reluctantly gathered their things, stealing glances at Min-jae as they filed out. Only when the last one had left did Professor Kim speak again. Sit down, Miss Park, he said, pulling up a chair beside the piano bench. You look like you might faint. Min-jae sank back onto the bench, her legs too weak to hold her. I'm sorry for deceiving you, she said quietly. I'm more interested in why someone with your talent is working as an administrative assistant, Professor Kim replied. And why you've been hiding it so carefully. The genuine concern in his voice broke through Min-jae's defenses. Before she knew it, she was telling him everything. The years of training, the pressure, the competitions, and finally, the devastating panic attack on stage in Warsaw that had ended everything. I couldn't face anyone after that, she concluded. Not my teachers, not my parents. Especially not my parents. They had sacrificed so much for my career. She looked down at her hands. I haven't touched a piano since then. Not until 2 weeks ago. Professor Kim was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, do you miss it? The question caught Min-jae by surprise. No one had ever asked her that before. Everyone had always been focused on her talent, her potential, her future, never on what she wanted. Yes, she admitted finally. Every day, Professor Kim nodded thoughtfully. What you just played, that wasn't just technique. That was music. Real music, he paused. Whatever happened in Warsaw, you haven't lost your gift. Min-jae shook her head. It doesn't matter. I can't perform anymore. The panic. It would just happen again. Perhaps, Professor Kim said, or perhaps not. But either way, is that a reason to deny yourself the joy of playing, even if only for yourself? Min-jae had no answer for that. The thought of playing just for herself, not for competitions, not for audiences, not for her parents or teachers, was something she had never considered. Think about it, Professor Kim said, standing up. In the meantime, I'll respect your privacy. I won't tell anyone else who you are. Thank you, Min-jae said. But I think it's too late for that. She gestured toward the door. Those students already know. By tomorrow, the whole department will know. Professor Kim smiled slightly. Yes, I suppose they will. He gathered his teaching materials. For what it's worth, Ms. Park, I think this might be a good thing. Secrets take a lot of energy to keep. After he left, Min-jae remained at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember the good parts of her former life. The pure joy of mastering a difficult passage, the satisfaction of bringing a beautiful piece of music to life. By the time she returned to her desk that afternoon, A strange calmness had settled over her. The secret was out. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't have to pretend anymore. And that evening, for the first time since she was 15, Min-jae went looking for sheet music. Not Chopin, not yet, but perhaps some Bach, something structured and soothing, something to remind her hands what they were made for. Min-jae arrived at work the next morning to find a small crowd gathered around her desk. They scattered when they saw her coming, but their whispers followed her down the hallway. In the staff room, conversations stopped abruptly when she walked in. Even Mrs. Kang, normally so practical and unflappable, kept stealing glances at her throughout the morning. "Is it true?" Mrs. Kang finally asked during their lunch break, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "Were you really a famous pianist?" Min-jae set down her cup of tea. "I wouldn't say famous," she replied quietly. "But yes, I used to play professionally." "And you performed all over the world?" Mrs. Kang pressed. "With orchestras and everything?" "Yes." Min-jae's voice was barely audible. The older woman shook her head in wonder. "Why didn't you ever say anything? All this time we thought you were just—" She stopped herself, looking embarrassed. "Just an office worker," Min-jae finished for her. That's what I wanted everyone to think. Before Mrs. Kang could ask more questions, Min-jae's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Professor Lee asking her to come to his office immediately. With a sense of dread, she excused herself and headed down the corridor. She found not only Professor Lee waiting for her, but also Professor Yoon, the department head, and Professor Kim. They all looked up when she entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or wonder. "Min-jae," Professor Lee began. "Please sit down." She perched on the edge of a chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I understand there was quite a revelation in Professor Kim's class yesterday," Professor Lee continued. "He's told us about your background." Min-jae looked at Professor Kim, who nodded slightly, as if in reassurance. "I apologize for not being forthcoming when you hired me," she said, looking down at her hands. "I didn't lie on my application exactly. I just didn't include my musical career." "That's not why we called you here," Professor Yoon said. She was a stern woman in her 60s, known for her exacting standards. "We're more interested in what happens next." Min-jae looked up, confused. "Next?" Professor Lee smiled kindly. "Min-jae, a video of you playing Chopin yesterday has been circulating among the students since last night. One of them posted it online." Her stomach dropped. "Online? Where?" Professor Kim pulled out his phone and showed her a YouTube page. The video's title read, "Hidden Genius Office Worker Stuns Music Students with Chopin." It already had over 5,000 views. Min-jae felt dizzy. "I didn't give permission for anyone to record me." "We know," Professor Yoon said. "The student has been reprimanded. But the fact remains, people are watching this video and they're asking questions about you." The comments section was filling with messages. Some recognized her name and were expressing surprise at seeing her playing again. Others were speculating about why someone with her talent was working as an administrator. A few cruel comments mocked her. "Fall from grace." "We've been getting calls all morning," Professor Lee said. "From local news outlets, from other universities, even from a piano manufacturer asking for your contact information." Min-jae closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the rising panic. This was exactly what she had feared. The scrutiny, the questions, the expectations. "What do you want from me?" she asked, opening her eyes again. The three professors exchanged glances before Professor Yoon spoke. "Nothing you don't want to give, Min-jae. But we'd be remiss if we didn't point out that this situation presents an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "The university's annual faculty recital is next month," Professor Yoon explained. "It's an important fundraiser for our scholarship program. Having you perform would significantly raise the profile of the event." Min-jae shook her head immediately. "I can't perform in public. I haven't in 8 years. There's a reason for that." "We understand," Professor Lee said quickly. "Professor Kim told us about your experience in Warsaw. It sounds traumatic." "It was," Min-jae said simply. Professor Kim leaned forward. "Min-jae, no one is asking you to jump back into a competitive career. Just one piece in a friendly environment surrounded by people who support you." "You don't understand," she insisted. "The panic. It's not something I can control. When I get on stage, I just freeze." The memory of it made her hands tremble even now. "Performance anxiety can be treated," Professor Kim said gently. There are techniques, therapies. I've worked with many students who've overcome it. I'm not a student anymore, Min-jae pointed out. No, Professor Yoon agreed. You're a grown woman who's been hiding a remarkable gift. Don't you think it's time to stop hiding? The bluntness of the question caught Min-jae off guard. She had never thought of it that way, that she was hiding rather than protecting herself. Think about it, Professor Lee suggested. You don't have to decide today. Min-jae nodded, grateful for the reprieve. May I go now? I have work to do. Of course, Professor Lee said. But one more thing. Several reporters have asked for interviews. Would you like us to handle those, or would you prefer to speak with them yourself? The thought of facing reporters made Min-jae's chest tighten. Please tell them I have no comment. As she walked back to her desk, Min-jae felt the weight of eyes following her. The video was spreading. Soon people from her past would see it. Her former teachers, fellow musicians, perhaps even her parents, though they had moved back to their hometown after her career ended. She hadn't spoken to them in years, their relationship strained by what they perceived as her throwing away her talent and their sacrifices. For the rest of the day, Min-jae went through her tasks mechanically, barely aware of what she was doing. By evening, the YouTube video had over 20,000 views, and other news sites were picking up the story. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from unknown numbers, probably journalists who had somehow found her contact information. Finally, she turned off her phone and sought refuge in one of the practice rooms in the basement of the music building. No one ever used these rooms because of their poor acoustics and old out-of-tune pianos. But tonight, Min-jae didn't care about the quality of the instrument. She just needed a place to think. She sat at the battered upright piano, not playing, just staring at the yellowed keys. For 8 years, she had defined herself by what she no longer was, a pianist. She had constructed a new identity as Min-jae Park, unremarkable administrative assistant, and in a single day that identity had been stripped away, leaving her exposed and uncertain. Almost without conscious thought, her hands found their way to the keyboard. She began to play softly, not Chopin or any of the virtuosic pieces from her past, but a simple Schumann piece from Scenes from Childhood called Traumerei, Dreaming. It was one of the first pieces she had ever loved, before competitions and pressure had taken the joy out of music for her. As she played the gentle, nostalgic melody, Min-jae felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She wasn't sure if they were tears of grief for what she had lost or tears of relief at finally acknowledging the truth, that music was still part of her, would always be part of her no matter how hard she tried to deny it. The door creaked open behind her, but Min-jae didn't stop playing. She finished the piece, letting the final notes fade slowly into silence. That was beautiful, said a voice. Min-jae turned to see Hee-jin, one of the graduate students who taught theory classes. Sorry to interrupt. I heard the music and was curious. Min-jae quickly wiped her eyes. It's fine. I was just leaving. Hee-jin hesitated, then said, I saw the video of you playing Chopin. It was amazing. Thank you, Min-jae replied automatically, gathering her things. I hope you don't mind me asking, Hee-jin continued. But is it true what they're saying? That you had a panic attack during the Chopin competition and haven't performed since? Min-jae stiffened. Yes, it's true. I understand, Hee-jin said quietly. The same thing happened to me. Min-jae looked at her properly for the first time. You had a panic attack on stage? Hee-jin nodded. 3 years ago, at my graduate recital, I was playing Beethoven's Hammer Clavier Sonata, and halfway through I just couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't play. She smiled ruefully. That's why I switched to music theory instead of performance. But I still play, just not in the way I thought I would. For the first time since the video had appeared online, Min-jae felt a glimmer of hope. Here was someone who understood, who had gone through the same thing. Does it get easier? She asked. The memory of it? Yes and no, Hee-jin replied honestly. I still have nightmares about it sometimes, but it doesn't define me anymore. She paused. Have you considered playing again? Not professionally necessarily, but just playing? Min-jae thought about the Bach pieces she had bought the night before, still unplayed on her coffee table at home. I'm thinking about it. If you ever want to talk or play duets, or just have someone to listen who understands, Hee-jin offered. I'm usually here in the evenings. After Hee-jin left, Min-jae sat for a long time in the dim practice room. For 8 years she had believed she was alone in her failure, her fear. But maybe she wasn't. Maybe there were others who had faced the same demons and found ways to make peace with them. As she walked home through the cool evening air, Min-jae made a decision. She wouldn't perform at the faculty recital. That was still too much too soon. But she would stop hiding from her past. She would face the questions, the attention, and the memories, painful as they might be, and tonight, when she got home, she would play Bach, not for an audience, not for her parents or teachers or critics, but for herself, because despite everything, she was still a pianist. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't something to run from anymore. A week after the video went viral, Min-jae sat at her kitchen table staring at her phone. The screen showed a familiar number, her parents' home in Busan. They had called every day since the story broke, leaving increasingly urgent messages. She had ignored them all, but the guilt was becoming harder to bear. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Min-jae? Is that really you?" "Yes, Mom, it's me." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of muffled voices as her mother called to her father. "Your father is here too. I'm putting the phone on speaker. Min-jae?" Her father's voice was gruff, unchanged after all these years. "We saw the video." "You're playing again." It wasn't a question, but Min-jae answered anyway. "Not really. It was just one time for a class." "But you can still play like that? After all this time?" Her mother sounded both surprised and hopeful. "I guess so." Min-jae traced patterns on the table with her finger. "I'm sorry I haven't called." Her father cleared his throat. "We've been worried about you. All these years, hardly any contact." The familiar mix of love and pressure in his voice made Min-jae's chest tighten. "I needed time," she said, "to figure things out on my own." "And have you?" her mother asked. "Figured things out?" Min-jae looked around her small apartment, at the stack of sheet music on her coffee table, at the electronic keyboard she had bought 3 days ago because she couldn't stand not having a piano at home anymore. "I'm trying," she said honestly. "There was an awkward pause before her father spoke again. "Your professor called us." "Professor Kim." Min-jae sat up straight. "He what? Why?" "He wanted to talk about you, about what happened in Warsaw." Her father's voice softened slightly. "He said we should give you space to find your own way back to music. That pushing you would only make things worse." Min-jae was stunned. She hadn't expected Professor Kim to reach out to her parents, let alone advocate for her. "Are you coming home for Chuseok next month?" her mother asked, changing the subject. "It's been so long since we've seen you." The thought of going home, of facing her parents in person, made Min-jae's pulse quicken. But maybe it was time. "I'll try," she promised. After hanging up, Min-jae sat quietly, processing the conversation. Her parents had sounded different, less demanding, more cautious. And Professor Kim had called them? The thought was both touching and slightly annoying. He had no right to interfere in her family matters, but perhaps his intervention had helped. The next day at work, Min-jae sought out Professor Kim after his morning class. "You called my parents," she said without preamble. He didn't look surprised at her accusation. "I did. I hope you don't mind." "Why?" Professor Kim closed his sheet music and turned to face her fully. "Because I've seen too many talented young musicians destroyed by well-meaning parents and teachers who pushed too hard. I didn't want that to happen to you again." Min-jae was taken aback by his directness. "That's not your responsibility." "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But I care about what happens to you, Min-jae. Not just as a pianist, but as a person." His sincerity disarmed her. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I still don't know if I can perform at the faculty recital." Professor Kim nodded. "The offer stands, but there's no pressure. However," he added, "I do have another proposition for you." "What's that?" "Some of my advanced students have been asking if you might be willing to coach them, not as a formal teacher, but as someone who could offer insights into the pieces they're working on." Min-jae frowned. "I'm not a teacher. You don't have to be. Just share what you know, what you feel when you play, your approach to interpretation." He smiled slightly. "You might find it rewarding." Min-jae thought about it. Teaching had never been part of her plan. Her entire training had been focused on performing. But the idea of helping others, of sharing her love for the music without the pressure of performance, was appealing. "I'll think about it," she promised. Later that afternoon, Hee-jin found Min-jae in the staff room. "A few of us are having an informal gathering at my apartment tonight," she said. "Just playing music, talking. Nothing fancy. Would you like to come?" Min-jae's first instinct was to refuse. Social gatherings had never been her strong suit, especially with musicians. But she remembered her promise to herself to stop hiding. "Sure," she said. "What time?" That evening, Min-jae found herself in Hee-jin's cozy apartment, surrounded by a small group of graduate students and young faculty members. Some she recognized from the music department. Others were new faces. There was food, wine, and in the corner, an upright piano draped with a colorful scarf. At first, Min-jae stayed on the periphery, nursing a glass of wine and observing. The conversations flowed around her, debates about interpretations of Beethoven, jokes about strict professors, complaints about practice room availability. It was a world she had once been part of but had forgotten existed. The camaraderie of musicians, the shared language of those who lived for music. "Min-jae," Hee-jin called from across the room. "Jiho was just saying he's struggling with the third movement of Ravel's sonatine. Didn't you record that piece?" All eyes turned to Min-jae, who reluctantly nodded. "Years ago, yes." Jiho, a serious-looking graduate student, brightened. "I've been trying to get the opening right for weeks. The tempo marking says anime, but how animated is too animated?" Before she knew it, Min-jae was drawn into a detailed discussion about Ravel's intentions. The balance between precision and emotion, the challenge of making the arpeggios sound both technically perfect and effortless. "Could you show me?" Jiho asked, finally gesturing toward the piano. Min-jae hesitated, looking at the instrument. This wasn't a formal performance, just a demonstration for a fellow musician who genuinely wanted her help. Slowly, she moved to the piano and sat down. The keys felt different from the ones at the university, a bit stiffer, the action heavier. But as she began to play the opening of the third movement, those details faded away. She focused on showing Jiho what she meant about the tempo, about letting the music breathe while maintaining its forward momentum. When she finished the demonstration, there was a moment of appreciative silence before the questions started. How did she approach the middle section? What about the pedaling in measure 20? Did she think Ravel's fingering suggestions worked, or had she developed her own? Min-jae found herself answering easily, drawing on knowledge she hadn't realized she still possessed. It felt good to talk about music this way, not as a critic or a competitor, but as someone who simply loved it and wanted to share that love. As the evening progressed, others asked for her advice on pieces they were working on. Min-jae offered suggestions, demonstrated techniques, and even laughed at jokes about the peculiarities of famous pianists. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. When she finally left Hee-jin's apartment well past midnight, Min-jae walked home with a lightness in her step that had been missing for a long time. She hadn't performed exactly, but she had played. She had connected with people through music, and it had felt right. The next morning, she sought out Professor Kim before his first class. "I'll do it," she said. He looked up from his notes, confused. "Do what?" "Coach your students," and she took a deep breath. "I'll think seriously about the faculty recital." Professor Kim's face broke into a rare smile. "I'm glad to hear it. But I have conditions," Min-jae continued. "If I play at the recital, it won't be Chopin or Liszt or any of the competition pieces from my past. I'll choose something new, something I've never performed before." "That seems reasonable," Professor Kim agreed. "And I want to talk to someone about the anxiety. A professional." The words were difficult to say, but Min-jae knew they were necessary. "I can't promise I won't panic on stage, but I want to try to work through it." Professor Kim nodded solemnly. "I know an excellent psychologist who specializes in performance anxiety. Many musicians see her. I'll give you her contact information." As Min-jae turned to leave, Professor Kim added, "One more thing. The department has been discussing your position here." Min-jae froze. "My position?" "Yes, we feel that your talents are being wasted at the front desk." He handed her a folder. "This is a proposal for a new role, part administrative, part musical. You would still handle some office duties, but you'd also work with students, perhaps develop a small studio of your own eventually. The salary would be higher, of course." Min-jae took the folder with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to decide immediately," Professor Kim assured her. "Take some time to think about it." Over the next few weeks, Min-jae's life shifted in ways she could never have anticipated. She began meeting with 3 of Professor Kim's advanced students twice a week, helping them prepare for their upcoming recitals. She attended her first therapy session with Dr. Park, the psychologist who specialized in musicians' mental health issues. She even went home to Busan for a weekend, sharing an awkward but healing dinner with her parents. And every day, she played, sometimes classical pieces from her past, sometimes new music she was exploring. She played in practice rooms at the university, on her keyboard at home, and occasionally at Heejin's gatherings. But as the date of the faculty recital grew closer, Min-jae's anxiety began to build again. She had chosen her piece, Debussy's Clair de Lune, nothing too technically demanding but beautiful and expressive. She had practiced it until she could play it perfectly from memory. Dr. Park had taught her breathing techniques and cognitive strategies to manage her anxiety. Yet the thought of walking onto a stage, sitting at a piano with hundreds of eyes watching her, still filled her with dread. What if it happened again? What if the panic took over and she froze, humiliating herself once more? The night before the recital, Min-jae couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, played her piece one more time on her keyboard, tried the breathing exercises Dr. Park had taught her, but nothing calmed the storm inside her. Finally, at 2 a.m., she grabbed her phone and did something she hadn't done in 8 years. She searched for videos of her old performances. There were dozens of them, uploaded by competition organizers, music schools, fans. With shaking fingers, she pressed play on one from when she was 14, a performance of Chopin's first ballade. As she watched her younger self play with such confidence and joy, tears slid down Min-jae's cheeks. When had she lost that joy? When had music become a source of anxiety rather than pleasure? The answer came to her suddenly with perfect clarity. It wasn't in Warsaw during her public failure. It was earlier when she had started playing for others' approval, rather than for her own love of the music. Tomorrow, Min-jae decided she would play Debussy not for the audience, not for Professor Kim or her parents or anyone else, but for herself. And if the panic came, she would face it, because she was more than her fear. She was more than one bad performance, she was a pianist, and it was time to remember what that really meant. The day of the faculty recital arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Min-jae woke early after a fitful sleep, her stomach tight with anticipation. She went through her morning routine mechanically, shower, breakfast, choosing an outfit. She had bought a simple black dress for the occasion, nothing flashy. This wasn't about drawing attention to herself. It was about the music. As she pinned up her hair, Min-jae caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked different somehow. Older, certainly, than the 15-year-old girl who had fallen apart on stage in Warsaw, but also steadier, more present. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection. "Just play for yourself." She arrived at the university concert hall 2 hours before the recital was scheduled to begin. The stage was already set up, a grand piano positioned center stage, its lid raised to its full height. Min-jae stood in the wings, watching as the sound technicians adjusted microphones and lighting. "There you are." Professor Kim's voice came from behind her. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd changed your mind." Min-jae turned to face him. "I almost did. Several times," he nodded in understanding. "That would have been your right. But I'm glad you're here." "I haven't played on a stage in 8 years," she said, her voice barely audible. "What if I can't do it?" Professor Kim considered her question seriously. "Then you will stop, take a breath, and try again. Or you will bow and leave the stage. And life will go on." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This is not the Chopin competition, Min-jae. This is just music shared among friends." His words eased something tight inside her chest. Min-jae nodded gratefully. "Would you like to try the piano?" he asked. "Get a feel for it before people arrive?" The thought of walking out onto that empty stage was less intimidating than facing a full audience. "Yes, I think that would help." The concert hall was quiet except for the occasional murmur of technicians working in the back. Min-jae's footsteps echoed as she walked to the piano and sat down, adjusting the bench to her height. The keys gleamed under the stage lights, inviting her touch. She began with simple scales and arpeggios, warming up her fingers and getting used to the action of this particular instrument. It was a beautiful piano, responsive and warm-toned. Gradually, she transitioned to fragments of her chosen piece. Clair de Lune, testing different phrases, exploring how the hall's acoustics carried the sound. As she played, Min-jae felt her anxiety receding. This was familiar territory, just her and the piano, communicating through touch and sound. She closed her eyes and played the opening section of the piece in full, letting the gentle, rippling notes wash over her. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed Professor Kim had been joined in the wings by several other faculty members and some students. They were watching quietly, respectfully keeping their distance but clearly moved by what they heard. Instead of the panic she expected, Min-jae felt a strange calm. These weren't judges or critics. They were fellow musicians who understood both the joy and the terror of performance. Whatever happened tonight, they would understand. The hours before the recital passed quickly. Min-jae retreated to a small practice room to center herself, using the breathing techniques Dr. Park had taught her. She had been scheduled to perform in the middle of the program, not the high-pressure opening or closing slots, but a comfortable position between a violin sonata and a faculty string quartet. When it was almost time, Hee-jin appeared at the door. "Ready? They're on the piece before yours." Min-jae stood, smoothing her dress. "As ready as I'll ever be." Hee-jin squeezed her hand. "Just remember, the music is already in you. All you have to do is let it out." Together they walked to the wings of the stage. The violinist and pianist were just finishing their sonata to warm applause. As they took their bows and exited on the opposite side, Min-jae felt her heart begin to race. The MC announced her name and the piece she would be playing. There was a murmur through the audience. Many had heard about the administrative assistant who was actually a former prodigy. Some had probably seen the viral video. They were curious, expecting something spectacular. Min-jae took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she remembered, the audience a shadowy mass beyond them. She bowed slightly, then sat at the piano, adjusting the bench one last time. Her hands were trembling. She placed them in her lap and closed her eyes, taking another deep breath. In that moment of darkness, Min-jae thought of all the paths that had led her here. The childhood spent at the piano, the competitions and concerts, the disaster in Warsaw, the years of hiding, and finally, the unexpected second chance. Whatever happened next, she had already overcome so much just by sitting on this bench, ready to play again. She opened her eyes, lifted her hands, and began. The first notes of Claire de Lune floated into the hall, delicate, dreamlike. Min-jae focused on the sound, on the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, on the gentle pulse of the rhythm. As the piece built, adding layers of harmony and complexity, she felt herself sinking deeper into the music, carried along by its current. There was a moment as she approached the climax of the piece when the old fear flickered at the edges of her consciousness. Her heart rate quickened. Her breathing became shallow. But instead of fighting it, Min-jae acknowledged it. "Yes, I'm afraid," she thought, "and I'm playing anyway." The fear didn't disappear, but it receded enough for her to continue, to shape the ascending arpeggios that led to the piece's most passionate moment. As she played the rich chords that expressed Debussy's vision of moonlight flooding the world with silver light, Min-jae felt something break open inside her, not in the shattering way of her breakdown, but like a flower finally blooming after a long winter. She was playing, really playing, with all of herself, and it was beautiful. The final section of the piece returned to the gentle mood of the opening, the harmonies resolving into tranquility. Min-jae's fingers caressed the keys, drawing out the last droplets of sound until they faded into silence. For a moment, she sat perfectly still, hands resting on the keys, eyes closed. Then she took a deep breath and lifted her hands, signaling the end of the piece. The applause that followed was immediate and enthusiastic. Min-jae stood and bowed, her legs surprisingly steady beneath her. As her eyes adjusted to the lights, she could make out individual faces in the audience. Professor Lee and Professor Yoon in the front row, Mrs. Kang a few seats down, students she had been coaching and in the BA.